So yeah, my name's Duncan McCan. I lead the digital economy program at the New Economics Foundation. We're a London-based think and do tank looking to put people and the environment at the center of economics. Yeah, so this is a project that I've been working on for almost a year and a half now, where I've been working with Uber drivers to try and create an alternative that they would own and operate. It all started about a year and a half ago when the mayor of London surprisingly made an announcement that he was going to cancel the license of Uber because it was not a fit and proper organization to run a taxi firm. On the back of this, I wrote an article kind of outlining some of the problems with Uber and how we should really work towards some positive alternatives, either public or worker-owned. And we were just amazed by the positive response that we got, not just from drivers, some users, but also the tech community and regulators. And so we decided to try and turn this energy into a real campaign. So we launched a crowdfunder. We managed to raise a not insignificant amount of money, which then allowed me to pay Uber drivers to help me to build an alternative. And over the last year, we've been building the business plan, making sure that the numbers really make sense. We now have that business plan, it's completed. And the next activity we've got is to try and raise the capital necessary to actually start the business. It's nothing like the kind of capital that Uber's trying to raise, which is obviously Uber is the most highly capitalized company in the world. They've raised over $17 billion from venture capitalists. We have much more modest aims, and we hope that this will be transformational by putting drivers as the owners, most of the value, any of the profit going back to drivers, putting drivers in control about the conditions, the kind of surveillance, the kind of monitoring they have. And we believe this will be a real massive change to the way that drivers work. But it's a really interesting because the challenges don't come from necessarily where you would expect. So the market that we're going into, that we're going to kind of test our idea, they regulate quite heavily the fares. So already we have an element of protection against Uber's general tactic against all competitors, which is to throw some of their venture capital money and try and outcompete us. So we have a tiny bit of protection there, although no doubt Uber will be inventive as it always is. We face then a kind of structural challenge, which is that in Europe or in the UK, when I take an Uber, which I don't, the payment is routed through Luxembourg. And because the payment's routed through Luxembourg, they don't have to pay value-added tax on the transaction. Now, because we want to be obviously a good citizen, contributing tax revenue to the government, we are automatically a 20% disadvantage to Uber. So there's definitely that challenge, which is not one that's not often talked about in the media. We then have our big advantage, which is the drivers. Now, the general narrative is that Uber kind of really controls these drivers. And what we've been trying to tell the drivers is that really the drivers are in control. Uber have nothing but the platform. The drivers provide the labor, the drivers provide the capital in terms of the car and the insurance and the petrol and the upkeep. And if the drivers collectively decided to move to a new platform that offered them more control and better conditions, Uber would have nothing to say. They only have the platform. So what we have really focused on is winning over drivers by, one, explaining them that situation, making sure that instead of the 25 or 30% of the fare which Uber take, we hope to be much, much more modest. So between 5 and 10% is the maximum that we want to take. So we really have a good proposition for the drivers. We also have an advantage. So when Uber goes into a new market, they often have to use some of their venture capital money to pay drivers to sit around doing nothing. So indeed, some of the drivers that I've worked with on the project still remember those great days when Uber first came along and was paying them £30 an hour to literally just sit there and do nothing, waiting for a job to come. Now, obviously, that was a small blip in the history of Uber, and it very, very quickly turned into a much more kind of abusive relationship rather than the relationship that it started as. But I think our biggest challenge is really the customer. So customers, and especially in the UK, have grown used to Uber. Indeed, when the Transport Authority revoked the license of Uber, a petition, interestingly started by the PR department of Uber, became the fastest growing petition ever in the UK. It reached almost 1 million signatures in less than a week. Now, this has since been passed by the recent Brexit referendum poll, which got over 5 million in the same time. But it just shows the strength of feeling. And I remember talking to lots of people in London who couldn't conceptualize getting around town without Uber. And indeed, it varied from kind of young students who felt safer in an Uber than taking kind of night transport, despite the statistical reality that in some senses Uber is less safe than other modes of transport. But nonetheless, Uber had really managed to integrate itself into the architecture of the city and the way people move around it. Indeed, it's almost become a kind of noun or a verb. It's in such common use. So our biggest challenge is really the users. And we can't, because we want to be a cooperative, we're not going to be able to raise the huge amounts of money that Uber did. We can't use the normal tactic of ride-hail platforms, which is to throw free rides at people. So we have to become much more inventive about how we bring people on, and to kind of minimize the challenge of users. We've chosen a very specific place, which is called Brighton, which is in the south of England. It's known as a kind of radical centre. It has our one and only Green Member of Parliament is represented in Brighton. They have a history of kind of cooperatives and worker ownership. And so we think that this place offers the best opportunity for us to really kind of test out this model. So for the moment, we're kind of waiting to really start the company to kind of nail down the real detail of it. But there are a few things that kind of the drivers have been really clear on. Uber sees drivers and the data that they produce as a kind of stepping stone towards an automated future where they will no longer need the drivers. And what's really interesting in the context of a worker-owned cooperative where the drivers own it, it offers a really interesting opportunity for drivers. Even when we have self-driving cars, these drivers will still then be able to own the company that provides self-driving facilities. So we see it also as a stepping stone so that we kind of counter some of the unemployment problems with automation as these drivers move from being workers to kind of owners of a platform that continues to provide the service. But certainly we want to put, again, drivers in control. It's not up to me to kind of set those policies, and what I've been really just trying to do is just trying to facilitate other people to make those decisions. So interestingly, although the traditional unions have long had kind of both taxi drivers and what we call in the UK private hire vehicles, which is kind of where the category that Uber falls into, they have not generally tended to have Uber drivers as members, but a new union has emerged in the last few years called the IWGB, which is a fascinating union which is not only growing in membership, which is again unusual in the union sector, but is also really focused on unionizing the most precarious workers. So ride-hail, so Uber drivers, kind of takeaway couriers, so your Deliveroo's, Uber Eats, cleaners, domestic workers. They've really taken on that challenge of some of the hardest kind of communities to organize. And what's most exciting is they're winning some real battles. Again, together with some of these more established unions, they've taken Uber to court, they've taken Deliveroo to court, and importantly, with Uber, they've scored some really important victories, requiring Uber to now consider them as workers rather than as self-employed, which offers the potential for Uber drivers to have to be paid the minimum wage for hours they work, to accrue sick pay so that when they're sick, their employer has to meet some of their costs, and also holiday time. And these are really important steps, not just important for the workers themselves, but also important for anybody to enable the level playing field so that somebody else can compete with them. If the worker cooperative wants to offer all of those things and Uber just chooses not to, despite the law saying they have to, this puts out as an immediate disadvantage, something like the tax issue we spoke about earlier. Well, I think what's interesting is that certainly from the setting up a cooperative side, I think all that you need the policymakers to do is really enforce the existing regulation against the platforms. And that's been something that we're starting to see a backlash against. Some cities are really leading the way, probably Barcelona, Madrid are some of the most exciting ones. Barcelona recently rewrote the kind of terms of access for Airbnb. So now Airbnb is forced to share their data with Barcelona City to make sure that Barcelona remains a city that actual people can live in, not just a city that people can visit, which is obviously really, really important, but often forgotten. The Netherlands, Amsterdam, for instance, is trying to launch an alternative to Airbnb called Fairbnb as well, which is, again, a really interesting public response. So I think really the key is really to enforce existing regulations. I think although it feels like the Ubers and the Deliveroos, Airbnbs are so radically different that they require their own kind of policies and legislation. What we believe is, in fact, they're covered very much by the existing regulation and a lot that can be enforced. All we then ask is then for local authorities and public authorities to be supportive of what we're doing. Again, that was part of the reason why we chose to launch where we are, because we knew we would have a public authority and a system that would really support us. And I think what we also really need to do is really push the likes of so London and some of the bigger cities to also take a more proactive approach, like we've seen in Barcelona, where they're rewriting the terms of access to platforms the platforms should have over the cities that we live in.